right. We are, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to be finishing up tonight on our discussion on the Bible and homosexuality. We've already surveyed the Old Testament. I'm not going to do that. But what I would encourage you to do, if you've missed out on some things, you can always go to Woodridge's YouTube page, and we upload this there. So if you miss one, you can just go get it there. What we're going to do tonight is we have two passages of Scripture that we want to jump into, and this is going to land the plane for us on the New Testament discussion of homosexuality, specifically 1 Corinthians 6:9. And so you'll need your YouVersion or your Bible, your tangible Bible or your digital one. We're going to look at 1 Corinthians 6:9, and then we're going to look at 1 Timothy 1:10. We'll do that. And then we're going to get into the question, are they born this way? So we'll get there. And then if we have time, and we may not, if not, we'll pick up next time, we'll get into some more practical questions, like what would you do if, say, a married lesbian couple walks into the church that has a 4-year-old adopted child? What would you do? That's a very practical kind of pastoral question, but frankly, I have to deal with that. We have to deal with that, and so we'll go there. Okay, so y'all ready to go? You got your notes ready? Let's do this. So we're going to begin with 1 Corinthians chapter 6. So for those of you that are there, I want to give you a little bit of background. I did a whole series on 1 Corinthians a little while ago, and you're welcome to go there. But just as a little bit of background, Corinth was a highly sexualized society. That resonates with us a little bit, I would say. Sexual promiscuity was so prominent in Corinth that Corinthianize was a verb. And I've always thought this: if they verb your name, that's hardcore. I mean, you have left the building. But that was it. So if someone was Corinthianized, it meant that they had become a sexual deviant. It was a pejorative. And in fact, from people that were from outside of Corinth would talk about the Corinthians, it was always a pejorative. So for example, my hometown is Mineola, Texas. I don't know how many of you know Mineola, Texas. That's where I grew up. So I was born in Tyler. I was raised in Mineola. Back in the day, before it was called Mineola, people actually referred to it as Sodom. Wow. There's another town called Wills Point, Texas, that was called Gomorrah, at least by reputation. That means it wasn't a good reputation. If you go into Mineola, there are streets in a line like Buchanan and whatnot. Those are the names of the Texas Rangers that came in and cleaned the town up. And they did that mainly by killing people, for those of you that are wondering. So there you go. This is kind of like Corinth, right? They had more than 1,000 prostitutes in ancient Corinth. That's wild. There was one New Testament scholar I was reading, so this works out to about 1 out of every 30 people that you saw walking around Corinth was a prostitute. 1 out of 30. Now, most of the prostitutes were a part of what is called temple prostitution, and so usually that was connected to what might be called like ritualistic sexual acts. They actually incorporated it as a part of their worship, but it gives you the idea. Here's a second thing that is interesting: the worship of Dionysius. For those of you that have never looked into it, Dionysius was the god of wine, which I'm sure would be red wine, because that's the only good kind. But Dionysius was the... We are recording this, by the way, but Dionysius was the offspring of Zeus's adultery that angered Zeus's wife Hera. So this is all some fun background. She gets angry. So Zeus kind of steps out on her and impregnates someone else. Hera gets pretty chapped. Dionysius was the result of that union. Are y'all tracking with me so far? So she wanted to kill the result of the adultery that Zeus had committed. So the male god was Dionysius, but if you look in Corinth, he is always dressed like a woman. The he is dressed like a she. He had long hair like a woman, walked like a woman, if you just read the literature, and even used and manipulated his voice to sound like a woman. For example, you might want to look at Euripides if you want to read something about this. So the worshippers of Dionysius described him as both male and female. That's going to come into play next week when we start talking about transgenderism, okay? Or hopefully next week we'll start talking about transgenderism. So, bisexual. And they celebrated Dionysius' gender swap with their own reversals. So this was also a part of their worship. Men would dress like women. Women would dress like men. Men would act like women. Women would act like men. This was actually all a part and culturally celebrated in Corinth. Sounds a little bit familiar, doesn't it? You know, on both lines, right? On both lines. That's just some fun background. It's like if you don't have that, understanding 1 Corinthians 6, or just Corinthians for that matter, it's a little bit tough. The background matters. So let's take a look at 1 Corinthians. I'll start reading in chapter 6, verse 9, and then we'll just go for it. And last week, I was actually giving some of y'all the Greek. I was making references to Greek, and some of y'all were like, can you write that for me? And so I did in response. And then tonight, I'm just giving you 2 words that are going to be the key words that we have to unpack because your translations say something, and I'm telling you that's really debated. Malakoi and arsenokoitus. And yes, you did hear the word coitus, and you probably know what that means. But the rest of it is what gets a little bit tricky to unpack. So here we go. Here's what Paul says. Don't you know that the unrighteous will not inherit God's kingdom? Do not be deceived. No sexually immoral people, idolaters, adulterers, or here's what one translation says, males who have sex with males. No thieves, greedy people, drunkards, verbally abusive people, or swindlers, or thieves, might be another translation, will inherit the kingdom, God's kingdom. And here's what he says. Some of you used to be like this. This was you. This was you. But you were washed, you were sanctified, and you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ and by the Spirit of our God. That was you. You're seeing a couple of things here in Paul in 1 Corinthians 6. Did you notice something? He says, don't be deceived. And then he says, no sexually immoral people. Then you skip over, he goes, or males who have sex with males. Well, wouldn't that just fit into the category of people that are sexually immoral? Like, why repeat yourself if you're just meaning the same thing? Well, those are the key words. So malakoi and arsenokoitus. And I'm just going to unpack those for you. The relevant phrase is men who have sex with men, or males who have sex with males. For some, what they would say is that this is connected to, well, occult temple prostitution. And since what you were doing, not you, but since what was happening is you were actually considering this a part of your worship coming out of your previous life, well, you can't have anything to do with that. Right? You're now worshiping the Lord Jesus. You go down to verse 11. You have been washed. That's not a part of your life. Here's what maybe some modern liberal interpreters would do. What they would say is, see, so Paul's making a distinction here. He's not inherently speaking against loving same-sex monogamous relationships. Instead, he's talking about sexual relationships that are inherently connected to the practice of pagan worship. You see how they pulled it apart there? So one is okay, loving monogamous same-sex relationships. The other is not, because it draws you back into your old paganism. And that's what Paul was talking about. Or so the argument goes. I'm not saying I buy it. I just want you to understand that's where the argument goes. In fact, I don't buy it. But I'm going to tell you why. And here's why. Paul also, he speaks against homosexuality both here in 1 Corinthians 6:9 and in 1 Timothy 1:10. We also, last week, unpacked, Paul had something to say in Romans chapter 1 as well. So it's all the same Paul, right? Does that make sense? So he's not going to say something, for example, in Romans, where he's speaking against the homosexual lifestyle, not talking about same-sex desire. We're talking about people that are actively in this lifestyle. He's already said about it in Romans chapter 1. We specifically looked at verses 26 and 27. He's saying it again in 1 Corinthians 6:9. He'll say it again in 1 Timothy 1:10. That's why I'm saying, no, I think he is actually talking about this here. There's a New Testament scholar named David Wright, and I think he's basically right when he says this. Because these words don't show up anywhere else. Paul is literally making up words. Almost like my dad used to do when he was really mad at me. He was making up words. Here's what David Wright said. Paul's use of the term represents its first occurrence in any Greek literature. That's pretty cool. I'd like to be known for making up a word. But here's what he goes on to say. He said, it's likely correct to suggest that Paul derives these terms, malakoi and arsenokoitus, which I'll unpack here in a little bit, from Leviticus 18:22. Now, we've already unpacked that, but in Leviticus 18:22, that's one of the places where a homosexual lifestyle is prohibited. So he's actually getting it from somewhere, but how is he getting it there? From there. So both in Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus chapter 20, verse 13. And when you look at both of those texts in what is called the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, you can actually see where Paul is coming from. So he's going back into the Old Testament. He's looking at what has been codified in the law, and then he's basically putting terms to words in the Greek so that you can connect it to the law. That's, I think, is what is actually happening.
Are those Greek words then?
Yes. Yeah, those are Greek. This is not. That's Hebrew. But I ain't there yet, right? Yep, we'll get there. Okay, so how are we doing so far? All right, so here's what David Wright says. He argues, and other scholars that follow him here, is that the Pauline term for arsenokoitus, which is here, is a derivation of a phrase, arsenos and koitin. You know what coitus is because it's talking about bedding or sex. Arsen just means male. So it's a male that's bedding a male, is what Paul is actually saying. Malakoi, which happens in 1 Corinthians 6:9, that one's a little bit trickier, but it actually just means soft or effeminate. And often what that means is it refers to, in their culture, a passive partner sexually. So think about this. So on the one hand, you have arson, male, coitus, males having sex with males, and then he uses a word, malakoi, which means to be soft or effeminate. And we're just going to have to be adults in here. What that means is you're talking about one male is on the receiving end of the sex act itself. So in other words, he is actually taking on what would traditionally be the role of the female in the sexual union when it's a male with a female. Someone is giving, someone is taking. That's basically what Paul is getting at when he uses these words. So malakoi means like soft or delicate. But I also want you to take a look at the rest of the list, because this is what was interesting. When I was in a discussion one time on God and sex, kind of a real hodgepodge of a group, not everybody agreed in the room. They were pointing out these two words, and they said, if you look at Dale Martin, who teaches at Yale, Dale Martin would say we actually don't know what these words mean precisely because Paul coined them. So it's like you can't do a word study, right? Let's do a word study. Well, you can't. That's out. And so the way that they went with it was, so what that means is that you can't say that Paul was prohibiting anything here. Like if you don't know what it is, then you can't say that's what he's doing. Does that make sense? There was one thing that I brought up though, and I was like, I don't know, because I'm looking at the rest of the list, and if you look at the rest of the list, sexually immoral, which is a broad category for sexual sin. That could mean, for example, fornicating, so it's sex before marriage. It could be adultery. Right? So any deviation from God's plan for sexuality is what that word means. I think in the second part, the reason he's highlighting it is to make a point of emphasis. There is something that is being practiced here, and it's not supposed to be a part of God's church. So this has got to stop. Remember, you have left that way of life, and you've been washed by Jesus. I think that's what he's doing here. But to push back on the point, it's like, well, we can't say that Paul's prohibiting anything here. I'm like, well, I feel like I can. And the reason that I can is because the rest of the list, sexually immoral, idolaters, adulterers, thieves, the whole list is talking about a list of sins or vices. And it just strikes me as odd that in 1 Corinthians 6, he would give this whole list of things, but there's this one thing in there that's a virtue that is okay. It doesn't fit what he's doing there. He's actually calling people out for things so that they can right the ship, so to speak. That, I think, is what Paul is doing. So anytime you're interpreting, just remember to do that. They might zoom in on something and go, whoa, step back and take a bigger look at what's going on here. And you realize, that's a big list, right? That's a big list. It also, by the way, it also means that we need to exercise a little bit of caution here. And here's what I mean by that. For some, you do need to go into the passages that are addressing the topic that you're addressing. You have to do that. And when it comes to same-sex, not attraction, but a same-sex lifestyle, there's only 6 or 7 passages in the Bible. We're even landing the plane on those. But when you're interpreting the Scripture, I think you have to keep the whole thing in mind so that people can get a glimpse of what Paul is actually trying to say. I don't think that, for example, in 1 Corinthians 6:9, he's trying to provide an exception to something. This one's fine. The rest of it, sorry. That's out. Paul is also writing to Corinth, and they're pretty much wrapped up in Greco-Roman thought, as I think you know. So while it means, the word malakoi, while it means soft, if you look at some of the other literature, and I'm just going to give you some examples, think about it like this. Philo. Philo referred to men who wore makeup, thick perfume, wore women's clothes, or received the act of sex from another man. So we're talking about basically contemporary literature. We can draw from some things. Lucan referred to boys that were castrated or softened by the blade. Okay. There was another author named Phaedrus. He wrote a fable about a god who got drunk and accidentally attached female genitalia to men and male genitalia to women, and they were later called malakoi. They were called soft or effeminate. In other words, it's a broad term. Also, here's a little cultural fun for you. Men who shaved their chests in that culture were called malakoi. They were called soft. There's a Roman writer named Martial, M-A-R-T-I-A-L, said if you would shave your chest, you were indicating you wanted to receive sex from a man. Here's a little bit of cultural fun for you. So some might be making an inference. If you were back in that day and time and you were shaving your chest, you were saying something to people. So some might be making an inference from shaved chest to being the passive partner in a same-sex male relationship. Is this helping this kind of make a little bit of sense to you? There's a culture here. There's a context that all this is coming from. In 1 Corinthians 6:9, the word malakoi, soft or effeminate, it doesn't have any further explanation. So probably what it's referring to is what they already knew back then. You know, it's like when I wrote my grandma letters back when she was alive, and I would write her a letter. You know what I didn't do? I didn't say, you know, dear grandma, this is Jeremy, your 7th grandchild. She knew that, right? I didn't have to tell her, you know, working on my doctorate at Texas A&M. She knew. And here's why I bring it up, is because it's like the argument with Jesus, and like, well, Jesus actually never talked about same-sex relationships. And as I pointed out before, is because they already had an assumed body of knowledge. You didn't have to talk about it. Everybody just knew. And it's basically the same when it comes to this. It probably refers to effeminacy in the Roman sense, a man either trying to be a woman. You remember Dionysius? They celebrated this in the culture. But it definitely refers to a sexual sin. So I just hope that it made a little bit of sense. But it's connecting to this word there. So let me unpack this one real quick for you. Because once we get this, 1 Timothy 1:10 goes quick. It's like snap once you get this. This is the first time arsenokoitus occurs anywhere. So arsen means male, coitus means bed or has the force of slept with. The Old Testament, and I mentioned this before, there were other compound words with coitus in them that are explicitly sexual. And so if somebody's like, well, you got to do a word study, well, you can't. I'm like, I can't with this, but I can make some good connections here. So for example, we have this word doulakoitus. Doulakoitus. Doula means slave in Greek. Coitus, so you're having sex with slaves. So there was an inherent sexuality to that. So I'm like, well, if we know that there's an inherent sexuality to doulakoitus, then I feel like we can make a pretty strong case to man having sex with arsenokoitus. Is that fair? So the Old Testament, to get to that, when it was translated into the Greek, which was about 100 years before Christ, that's where you might see the LXX or the Septuagint. Most New Testament scholars would use the Septuagint instead of the Hebrew when they were reading the Old Testament, just as a matter of practice after it was translated. So arsenokoitus, it's interesting, it's not in the Septuagint, but there's a similar phrase that does show up. We see arsen and coitus in 2 verses in the Old Testament. They are there. Where are they? It's exactly where we went before in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. And that's why I said, I think Paul's just pulling it over. That's what he's doing. So he's taking from the law and he's pulling it into a Greek context. It's basically like saying, You need to hear from God. You need to hear a little less from Corinth. That's where you need to hear. Now, in Jewish literature, so everybody good on soft and effeminate? And males bedding males here. Mishka Zakur. There's the Hebrew for you. All right? I told you it would come up.
I just want the Greek.
You just want the Greek. I get it. There's a Hebrew phrase that's Mishka Zakur, which is the equivalent of arsena coitus. So, can you literally do a word study on it? And the answer is no, not literally the way that we traditionally do. Can you do a correlation word study on it? And the answer is, yeah, we can do that. That we can do. So both the Greek and the Hebrew are almost identical to the wording in Leviticus 20:13. Almost identical. And remember, Paul knew Hebrew. Did y'all know that? He did. He kind of grew up with it, right? He knew a thing or two. So he knew Hebrew. He knows Greek. So he's writing to the Greeks in Corinth. So perhaps what he's doing is inventing the Greek word to express the Hebrew thought. I think that is probably the best way of understanding that word. And then what that means is, and I'm going to get my U version out. If you look at 1 Timothy 1:10, and I should have already had that up, but I don't. Look at 1 Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 10. And then I will read it for you. I just have to find it. Okay. So there is this, starting in verse 9 actually, Paul says, we know that the law is not meant for a righteous person, but for the lawless and the rebellious, for the ungodly and the sinful, for the unholy and the irreverent, for those who kill their fathers and mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral. That probably might make your ear go, I think I've heard that before. And males who have sex with males, for slave traders, liars, perjurers, and for whatever else is contrary to sound teaching that conforms to the gospel concerning the glory of the blessed God, which was entrusted to me. Oops, he just did it again. To quote Britney Spears, he just did it again. He's using the same word. He uses arsena coitus, and notice even there he does it in a list of not virtues, but it's in another list of vices. Now, be clear here, friends, it's a list. And if there's anything that I think I've seen maybe mishandled, is when one word in a list gets singled out and none of the rest of the list is talked about. And friends, that's fair. You know, if what you're trying to do is to zoom in on a sin that isn't yours, and you're using this to indict someone, you can see how that's not necessarily working in good faith with people. It's like, well, how about the rest of the list? How are you looking? Right? Because it's a substantial list. I mean, just this last Sunday, I talked about idolatry. Right? Here we are in the book of Daniel. And in Daniel chapter 3, I said there are two main themes, courage, but idolatry. Nebuchadnezzar's just happened to be a statue. Again, I've removed mine from my house, of me. It's gone. Too much conviction from it. But our idols are actually a whole lot more subtle, aren't they? But they are real. Why don't we kind of dial in on that one? Because actually Paul refers to sexual sin as a form of idolatry. It's one of the things you worship. And by the way, I would agree. Just look at our culture. The way that it's consumed our attention, our time. You get the idea. So I'm just throwing that in there. Yeah.
So along those lines, why is this particular issue so divisive amongst the church itself, as opposed to all the other lists of sins? I guess you don't see. You don't.
Yeah. And let me repeat it because we're recording it. So the question was why is this one the one that is so divisive, and the rest of them everybody's like, well, yeah, I mean, yeah, adultery, yeah, it shouldn't do that, right? Basically, right? Because that's in the list, and I think there are a couple of things that I've seen. One is, as I've tried to point out, people are pushing back on the interpretation of these passages. I want you to see, well, no, I think the passages are actually teaching this. So there is that. But second, you're going to, think about the theme of Sunday mornings right now. If you want to make a difference, you're going to have to be different. There's just going to be, and I don't mean in your personality where you're weird. Right? And then you blame that on Jesus. No, you're just weird. I'm talking about, I didn't name names, but I can. No, I'm talking about in terms of your values, if you think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when he says you're going to bow down, and everybody drops to the ground, and you got 3 that are standing up, man, they just stood out. They're standing up. They're very visible. I think it's the same. We're in a Daniel moment right now. Some of this, I would like to say, is rightly motivated, yet wrong. So it's like, well, I have a friend that is gay. Well, so do I. There isn't anything in the world I wouldn't do for them. But honestly, I would hope that if I were doing something immoral, that they would call me out on it. I would hope. I would hope, lovingly, but do it. It doesn't fit the cultural climate any more, by the way, than it fit Corinth. You're going to be different, right? Isn't that what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 6? This is not you. There is a new way for you. You have been washed with Jesus. So I think there is a cultural moment where to hold to this is going to have a label, either a phobe of some sort, like you're a homophobe, you're a transphobe, or you're something like that. But I'll be honest with you, when people make that move, it immediately kills the conversation. It's over. The minute people go to labels and they're not actually dealing with what you're trying to say and why, we've lost the conversation. As I pointed out when we started this, and I think it bears repeating, everybody is making a moral judgment on this, so we're all judgy. Every last one of us. So if you say, for example, homosexuality is morally permissible, that is a moral judgment. If you say homosexuality is morally impermissible, that is a moral judgment. We're all judgy. We figured that out. The question is who's getting it right? Which is why I was taking us to the Word. I think your hand is up, but I can't tell.
Yeah, and homosexuals, is that for the immoral men, the soft one, or the homosexual? Because I think immoral men are the same as homosexuals.
So generally speaking, so immoral men and homosexuals, if they're kind of pulled apart like that, it's casting a broader net. And I mentioned last week in Romans chapter 1, it's the only time that female homoeroticism is explicitly mentioned. However, what do you typically call a female and a female that are engaged in a sexual relationship with each other? And the answer is homo, meaning of one kind in one kind of sex. So it would cast a broader net because it could be men and women, but it's also dealing with something specifically with males here. Does that help? Okay. Where was I even? Well, I don't know, but boy, we were having fun there, weren't we? Okay. Well, we were in 1 Timothy 1:10. All right. Did I answer you okay there? Yeah. I think we're in a cultural moment. Grace?
The way you said that they find a loophole in the fact that he wasn't talking about homosexual loving relationships. Well, for that matter, his list isn't all-inclusive. There are some sins that he doesn't mention specifically. He's not saying that those are okay because he didn't mention them.
Right. So if something isn't mentioned, that's not an inherent "this is okay." Yeah. No, that's absolutely fair. And now let me build on that for a second, because here we are in 1 Timothy 1:10. Paul uses arsenokoitus again, but here's what's interesting. What's interesting is he makes a reference to the law in verse 9. Did you catch that? To the law. By the way, which is the Mosaic law. He's talking about the Pentateuch. And then, if you think about the Pentateuch, what do you get there? And the answer is, well, you get the 10 Commandments that are there. Now think about this, because he gave a list of things. Did you catch this? He's giving a list. He's following the 10 Commandments in the list. If you're paying close attention to what he's unpacking, he's following it. Let me give you an example. He mentioned in the list people that kill their parents. Did you see that? That's the 5th commandment, right? Honor your father and mother. Killing them doesn't do that. Okay. All right. I think we figured that out. Murder. Talks about murderers. That refers to the 6th commandment. You shall not murder. He talks about the sexually immoral, and here the arsenokoitus, both refer to the 7th commandment. You shall not commit adultery. He talks about thieves or kidnappers, depending on your translation. That's the 8th commandment, right? Don't steal. That would include people, but don't steal.
Rape, because rape is stealing sex.
Well, that would also include other things when you cast liars and perjurers. He mentions that. That's the 9th commandment about not bearing false witness, which has a court kind of sense to it, like in a court, but broadly construed in general. So the question becomes, well, how is arsenokoitus like adultery then? If you're kind of like bundling it all together. And here's the answer. The 10 Commandments were the source for other commandments in the Pentateuch. You actually see, as you read on, like if you read Exodus, for example, it starts to get much more specific applications of commandments that God has already given. It's like, you remember this commandment about your sexual ethics? Yeah, this. And you might see it in the commandments to the people as they're like journeying back to the promised land. It starts to get very specific. Why? Because their sins were getting really specific. That's why. It's like, remember when I said this? Yeah, this falls into that category. So stop it. Right? Good pastoral moment. Stop it. That, I think, is the answer. So hopefully that helps a little bit on that. And I want to put this little proviso, and then we're going to jump into another question here. When it comes to arson of coitus, let me be clear here. It's not talking about a person that really struggles with same-sex attraction. That's not what it's actually talking about. It is talking about people that are actively engaged in the lifestyle. We all have broken desires. And the temptations actually kind of crop up from the broken desires that we have. That can, in a man, that can manifest for a sexual desire for a woman that isn't his wife, right? This would fall into the same category, is what I'm saying. But to have the desire is one thing. That's not what it's saying. And again, those desires are coming from a broken place. We can understand that. I'll actually get to that here in a little bit. It's talking about a person that says, no, this is my way of life. That's what it's talking about. So here's the question here's an interesting question that this brings up, and I want to look at James chapter 1 verses 13 and 14 really fast. Did I say that right? Yeah, James 1, 13 and 14. Here's what it says. No one undergoing a trial should say, I'm being tempted by God. Since God is not tempted by evil, and He Himself doesn't tempt anyone, but each person is tempted when he is drawn away and enticed by his own evil desire. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and when sin is fully grown, it gives birth to death. Did you notice a distinction that James actually made here in verses 13 through actually 15 as I read it? There was a difference between the desire that you have itself and the desire that actually gives birth to sin. Those were not the same thing. So to talk about the desire that a person might have, you need to address it, recognize it for what it is, but then push people on to holiness, which is what Paul did in 1 Corinthians 6. You have been bought with a price. That language, you can't do what you want with your body, right? Romans 12, present your body as a living sacrifice. This is an act of worship that is holy and pleasing to God. All of this, I think, comes together to make that point. Is your hand up again?
Yeah.
Or not? I can't tell. All right.
Yeah. In Matthew 5:28, how do you explain when Jesus says, but I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust, for he has already committed adultery with her in his heart.
Yeah, I think it's talking about the brokenness that is inherent to us. It comes with the pact. But the question is what do you do with it? Not a matter of do you have it. I do think there is a distinction there. Even in Romans chapter 1, Paul explicitly uses the word acts, the things you do, right? Otherwise, you're also going to have a real hard time with Jesus and His temptations, right? I mean, if you correlate the temptation of Christ to a desire that's likened to a desire that we would have to sin, yet He doesn't, which He didn't, according to Hebrews. You see what I'm saying here?
Yeah.
Otherwise, He wasn't like us at all.
But He wasn't tempted. He was tempted by Satan. But
He was tempted.
But he didn't.
Yeah, He was. There might be a distinction there that it wasn't inherent to Him, but He gets the draw. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. But
right?
But He, you know.
I get the difference that you're trying to say, but I think what it's getting at is something deeper. We have to deal with an inherent brokenness to us, and you have to deal with desires that might come inherent to you and what you do with them, right? Here's the other question that I wanted to bring up, and it deals with 1 Corinthians 5. I'm going to kind of get big picture here on this. You remember what was going on in 1 Corinthians 5? You've got a guy that's having a sexual relationship with his mother-in-law, and Paul does this. He's like, what are you doing? Right? And to the church, he actually asked this question. He's like, I'm trying to figure out why they're like still among you. Why have you not cast them out? Now, that sounds harsh, doesn't it? Because especially nowadays where it doesn't seem like churches really believe in church discipline at all. I won't say that for us. We do. And it's never a joyful thing. You know, I've been asked, have you ever had to remove somebody from Woodridge? And the answer is, yeah, I have. I have. I don't enjoy it. I lose sleep over it. But every step for restoration is what was taken before that happened. Go read Jesus on this. It's what he said. You got to go to Matthew 18 and Luke 17. You go, you try to make restoration wherever that's possible. Sometimes the hardest part of the church is the work of calling people out for their sin. And you know what? I've never found anybody like it. And you know what? I don't either. So I'm just going to be like everybody else. I don't like it. I don't enjoy it. Pride kind of rears its head. Here's the question though. Can you have people that are actively in, not struggling like with same-sex attraction, but are actively in and say, like, they are not just same-sex attracted, they are married to each other, they are sexually active with each other. The question becomes, what do you do with that in the church? That's tough, isn't it? You know, especially if you're me and probably the one that's going to have to do something. A couple of things to think about. Here's one. And I'm just going to let you know this is debated. One way of interpreting this is if you find a person that is not, again, struggling with desires, but they are fully bought into them. If you look at what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 6, one of the ways of understanding it is that's the best way for you to know that they're not a Christian. Now, read the whole list and be careful. Be very careful. That was quite a list. But again, you're talking about a person that is genuinely unrepentant. This will be my life. I don't care what you think. And that could fall into any of the other sins that are listed there. Kind of the by their fruit you will know them. One of the ways of interpreting this is you have really good reason for saying they don't know Christ. Remember what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 6 with that? Some of you used to be this way. Does that make sense? So what do you do? Well, in that rendering of it, what you would do is you don't put church discipline on a person because they're not a believer. They're not a believer. Church discipline is for the church, which means the brothers and sisters. Those that are in the fold. Those are people that are of the faith. So I'm letting you know that's one way of looking at it. You can get that from a number of New Testament scholars. And then others would just go the other route and say,
so-called brethren, and saying in Corinthians that those who say they're Christians, you have to believe that they're Christians until.
Do you believe everybody that says they're a Christian that they're Christians?
The heart, though.
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying. So then the question becomes, if you just assume that they are, so that would be the second way of looking at it. So if you just assume and take them at their word that they are confessing Christ, then yeah, you have to put church discipline on them. So those are the two main ways that you would handle it. One, if they're not actually a confessing believer because they have unrepentant sin, then what do? You try to draw them to Jesus. That's what you do. On the other hand, if you just take them at their word and they go, well, you said that you're a Christian, you have to deal with what the word is telling you about your life, and you need to come in line with Christ. That's when discipline kicks in. Do you see the two ways that it typically gets handled in churches? So there you go. All right.
But then they usually just go find a church that supports their thinking.
Well, no, they do.
They have family members that this is.
No, yeah. So what do they typically do? And the answer is, you know, they'll typically find a church that is, and I'm going to get into this here in a little bit. Yeah, so I'm going to get into here. I almost went somewhere. I'm like, we'll hold off on that for a second. But typically what they'll do is they'll find what's called an affirming church, right? Now that said, you still have to deal with the word, but they'll find an affirming church. Brian, was your hand up?
Yeah, and I'm just, like you said, it's an exhaustive list, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, and obviously tonight we're talking about homosexuality and you're talking about church discipline for them, you know, and welcoming those that are in that lifestyle. I mean, what about the adulterer? What about the liar.
And that's my point. What about the adulterer? What about the liar? What about bearing false witness? That would be a gossiper. Have you? Now, again, the key here is we're talking about a person that is actively in an unrepentant lifestyle too, right? They're in an unrepentant life. So if you look at Matthew 18 and Luke 17, there are active steps that the church takes to restore them back, not to you, but to Christ. Have you ever had to restore a brother or sister back to Christ? I have. Greg, I've had to be restored back to Christ. What am I talking about? I've had to be restored and have people, my mom and my dad, for example, about, look, right, those moments. And that's to your point. And that's why I said, slow your roll. Because before you jump on one, read the rest of the list slowly. And what should you say in humility? Is this me? Is this me? For persons that are dealing with same-sex attraction, they already know it. They know it. Some of the other stuff that we deal with, we find a way to cover it. It can be much more subtle, just like the study on idolatry. I hope that was helpful on Sunday. Did y'all take a picture of my list up there and walk away like that? I didn't like that. No, I'm just kidding. All right. So let me.
But it was a little blurry if you could have.
It's a little blurry. You're fine. It was a little blurry. You're fine. Okay. Let me shift gears a little bit. I want to talk just a little bit, not a ton. The question came up on born this way. Are people born this way? And I think that's an interesting question. There's a ton of literature out there on this. So there are two researchers. Last name is Stanton and Yarhouse. Stanton and Yarhouse. They're both Christians that specialize. They're clinicians that specialize in this, and I think they have some fantastic stuff that honestly you can go online and read if you want to. But the question always comes up, is this nature? Is it nurture? Is it a mix of both? Is it like naturing and nurturing? Like what's going on? I want to point a couple of things out. Even if we were to say a person is born a certain way, it doesn't mean that it ought to be affirmed. Did y'all hear what I said? Even if we said a person was born a certain way, which, by the way, the literature would tell you that's not the way to go. But I'm just making a point here. Even if we say a person is born a certain way, it does not mean that we ought to affirm whatever we're talking about. So people born with a tendency toward aggression, like they have the extra X chromosome. Like we know these things, right? Yeah, so I guess you need to go be aggressive. No, I think you need to don't. Right? People born with a tendency toward aggression. What about people born with a tendency to criminal activity? People that are born with people naturally struggle with alcoholism because of a long history of it in their family. People that have actually have case studies on rapists. I mean, the recidivism rates on rapists, you have a better chance of getting off heroin. What's going on there? There's a lot of literature. It's really, really difficult, but most of them would say it was always there, and then usually they connect it to pornography at some point, and then off it goes. And I mean, way off it goes. I'm just making a point here, right? In other cases, we wouldn't sit there and say, well, you know, if you were born with that genetic predisposition, then I mean, what do I say? Well, what we say is don't act on it. That's what we say. Tendencies, by the way, also don't tell us on how to live. They tell us about tendencies. But it's also a point to remember, you know, Paul says in Ephesians 2:3, he says there's certain sins that are literally etched in your flesh. It's etched in your flesh. So we want to take that seriously. I think in the literature, a couple things to keep in mind. It's better to refer to influences rather than causes. It's better to talk about influences rather than causes, especially, well, we're talking about sexual attraction, so let's apply it there. And there's often layers to this in individual situations. So it's like, well, there's probably just one thing that made this person struggle with same-sex attraction. No, you read a little bit more. It's more complicated than that. Usually there are multiple influences. There's a guy named Chad Thompson who wrote a book called Loving Homosexuals as Jesus Would. And he pointed out that gay adults often seek love and affirmation from fellow males because they had emotionally distant fathers and negative father experiences. By the way, that literature, there's a lot of it. Like, a lot. The more and more they dig, the more and more they're finding that connection. But that's only one. It's only one. There was a study in 1994 of 117 gay men. 86% said they spent little to no time with their father. 50% said that they didn't believe their father loved them at all. 45% said their father belittled or humiliated them. 18% said that their relationship with their father was pretty good. There's a correlation there, right? Now, right now, they're just trying to unpack what all that means, but there's a correlation there. There's a researcher named Elizabeth Moberly. She said this, that the homosexual, whether man or woman, has suffered some deficit in the relationship with the parent of the same sex, and there's a corresponding drive to make good this deficit through the medium of a same-sex relationship. So guess what that means they're finding out? Girls with moms, what that relationship looks like. Well, turns out it really matters. If what a girl has is a controlling, domineering, unloving, they're finding some results here. And then what they look for is maybe a female that is loving, that is kind. You see where that's going? And then loves them the way that they thought their mother should. They attach themselves to her in that way. I'm just letting you know. Paul Copan, he's a friend of mine. He said, neither biology nor environment are destiny. Neither biology nor environment are destiny. And by the way, parents, that would be an environment, right? The house you're growing up in. Influences that lead to homosexuality often involve a combination of factors. So he agrees with the literature, but listen to a couple of the things that he says. On the biological side, males and females may have natural dispositions. For example, athletic versus non-athletic, aggressive versus gentle, or even interests, different interests like athletic versus artistic. Okay, y'all all know that. Those are different dispositions. But then he says this, psychological and social influences, including the sexual environment where any sexual behavior is permitted, makes a difference. So what's your cultural climate? So we just talked about Corinth. What was the cultural climate there? Well, pretty much everything was going, right? Well, shock of the world, what were they doing? Everything, right? They were doing everything. Cultural climate matters. Bill Maher, who's not exactly what I would call a conservative commentator, he is definitely not a Christian. He has this segment of his show called New Rules. I am not going to show it to you because he actually uses some language and whatnot. However, the transgender community has really come after him because of one segment. So if you put in Bill Maher, M-A-H-E-R, and you put in transgenderism, the New Rules is probably going to come up. And he talks for about 10 minutes. And one of the things that he says is interesting. Well, there are a couple of things he said that was interesting. He said, he said, I'm trying to find out why it is that people act like this is just a normal thing. He said, we need to slow things down. He said, because this, talking about transgenderism, is happening at a rate that is unprecedented in history, and you are literally experimenting on children. You need to slow down. I think he's 100% right on that. He said, but an interesting observation is, if you look at the rate of kids struggling with transgenderism and wanting gender reassignment surgery in California, it's off the chart. But you don't really see it in Youngstown, Ohio. He said, so either you're creating it in California or they're prohibiting it in Ohio. Cultural environment. We'll do transgenderism starting next week. But I just wanted to give you that. Or started at least. I just wanted to give you that. Here's basically the point. There can be a cumulative contribution to same-sex attraction. There can be a lot of things going on here. Experiences, choices, moral, cultural climate. You see what I'm saying? There are a lot of things. Right now, it could be just trendy. Why be transgendered? People are pointing out it's kind of trendy. Trendy. More on that later. Think about this in terms of the moral cultural climate. There are some things that would fly in another culture that would never fly here. Did you know, ladies, that if you go to Papua New Guinea, you could walk around topless and men don't care. But if you're wearing like jeans, you better be careful. And the reason is because the pelvic area of the woman is what they find sexually stimulating. Now that's just a cultural moray, meaning a practical difference, but they still have a regulated sexual morals because they think it's to be protected. It's important. There's something sacred here. Anyway, what are some of the other factors in the research here? Childhood trauma. That has included even studies of kids from divorced families where the kids are basically abandoned after the divorce. Sexual abuse or molestation. There's prolific amounts of literature there that when you kind of peel things back and you look in and you go, okay, so all of a sudden, this person is struggling with same-sex attraction. And then you get into the story a little bit. This isn't every time. You've got to be fair. But there's a lot of literature here. And you go, wait, this girl was raped. This girl was sexually abused. This boy was sexually abused when he was 7 years old. That is a mountain of literature there. You might want to pay attention to that. Persecution from same-sex peer groups. In other words, you don't even see, does that make sense? Poor parent relationships, I've already talked about that. A passive, detached, unloving father, a controlling, interfering, unloving mother. It might not be one thing, but here's what we do know. We do know that it is not purely biological. We know that for a fact. Let me give you a couple of things here on biology. There was a study by a guy named Michael King and Elizabeth McDonald on 46 homosexual identical twins. That's a mouthful. 46 homosexual identical twins. Here was the catch. They were reared separately from birth. So the environment just changed, right? So they followed up with them after some years, and this is what they found. None of the females, which were 4 pairs, shared a homosexual preference. Not one. Only one male pair of the rest of them actually did. So if somebody is going to say, all right, so this is kind of comes hardwired in you, no, it doesn't. It doesn't. Identical twins means, well, identical. We're talking about an identical DNA here. What was the salient difference between the two? One was raised over here, one was raised over here. And with that found, literally in all of it, what did you find? One pairing where there was a common same-sex attraction. So there's definitely more going on here than just that. This is why I pointed out Lisa Diamond. Yeah?
Were you saying that of the identical twins, one was and one wasn't environment they grew up in?
No, what I'm saying is literally out of 46 pairings, 46 identical twins, there was only one in all of them that had both were same-sex attracted. None of the rest of them were. None of the girls, and it was only 2 boys that were. Does that help? Yeah. Lisa Diamond, I mentioned her last week, and I'm going to bring her up again. She was the one that I said is a lesbian agnostic. She's the professor at the University of Utah. She has written prolifically on this. Here's what she found. She found that among those who had come out as homosexual, pay attention to this, 84% of women and 78% of men changed their identity label at least once to either bisexual. Well, all of a sudden it's like, well, maybe I'm not just attracted to a woman if you're a woman, or a man if I'm a man. It's like, you know what? She looks pretty cute. Right? Okay. 84% changed their label of women, 78% of men, at least once, to either bisexual, queer, or even flat out heterosexual. So left the gay lifestyle, never went back to it, but they at one time were actually in a committed homosexual lifestyle. Okay, here's what she also went on to say. Many people do not fit neatly into the prescribed categories, and here's what she found. Among those who identify as homosexual, 40% of men and 48% of women reported sexual attraction to the opposite sex in the previous year. So just take the last 12 months, and most of them are like, I don't know, there's something attractive about the other. In fact, 12% of homosexual men and 9% of lesbians reported having sex with someone of the opposite sex in the last year, even though they were identifying themselves as homosexual. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? So the New Scientist concluded this. Sexuality is fluid. You see what they're getting at now? Things are kind of like changing. Sexuality is fluid. And here's what they said. It's time to get past the born this way. It's not true. It is not true. Now, we got to take this seriously, because here's the part that kind of gets to me. If there is a host of brokenness that is in the background there, then there's something about that that just hurts my heart for people. Doesn't it you? And it doesn't make anything right. I think I've been clear. I wanted to go through Scripture first. But there's something in those stories that and I wasn't worried about reading you case stories and whatnot, but when you read what has happened to some people, I'll give you one example. This was some years ago. But I remember some parents coming to me and saying, my daughter is struggling with same-sex attraction. What do I do? And I said, okay. I said, well, what's going on? Well, we're not sure. Are you okay if I meet with your daughter? Sure. And she and I had a good relationship with each other, so good. It took a little bit because you're talking about some difficult stuff, right? And I want her to know, I'm on your team, right? I'm here to help. And after like 3 weeks of meeting with her, she walks in what would be the fourth time that we had met. And she sits down, she's kind of quiet, and she just goes, okay. And I'm like, all right, I think it's about to happen. All right? She's about to unload it. And this is what had happened. She had found when she was at home the stash of porn that her dad had been watching. And whatever it was that he had been, I'm not going to get into it with you. I know what it was. But she had found it. And she watched what he had been watching. And it was not your run-of-the-mill pornography. And what she took from it, because we're not talking about a 25-year-old woman, we are talking about an 11-year-old girl. And what she took from it was, this is what sex is. And basically, when she kind of started spelling, and you can understand, she starts to weep. She's like, I can't get this out of my head. I can't not see this anymore. But here's what she said. Over my dead body, is that going to happen with me? So she correlated the viewing of hardcore pornography with what a normal, intimate, healthy sexual relationship is like between a husband and a wife. And she goes, it's never going to happen. You get what I'm getting at now? That's one example. I've also had plenty of experience of sitting down with males that were seriously sexually abused, women that have been the product of rape and so forth, and I'm telling you, it's there. That said, it's only part of the story, because there is healing too. And it often there's often I'll get to you, but let me at least say this. There's often a story here, and I want to encourage you in this. Rosaria Butterfield. I don't know how many of you have heard of her. I had the chance to meet Rosaria Butterfield when I was, a professor some years ago in Wake Forest. She has a pretty incredible testimony because she came out of a homosexual lifestyle. She was a tenured professor at Syracuse University. Finds Jesus. And how did she find Jesus? And the answer was, there was a pastor and his wife that got to know her, welcomed her into their home, loved her deeply. All of her misgivings about hateful Christians kind of washed away. And after that washed away, all of a sudden she was willing to listen to what the loving Christians that she had prejudged were actually all about. And lo and behold, she gives her life to Christ. She has an amazing story. You can go YouTube it. Rosaria Butterfield, right? It says something about the power of hospitality. And I'm just going to make a point here. Maybe sometimes you need to slow down and get to know somebody a little bit. Find a little bit about what's going on in the background there. Be a part of the healing process. Go see her story. That's just a little bit. I just wanted to give you an idea. But most importantly, because the question was asked, are people born this way? The answer is, it's not really the way it goes. It's not. Go ahead.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
I'm 65 years old.
Yeah.
And when I was in high school, I didn't even know what a homosexual was.
Yeah.
That has changed so, it's so prevalent in that
Yeah.
short of a time.
Yeah.
And the transgender, we
I'll
were
repeat it for the point of the recording. It's like when you were in high school, you're 65. When you were in high school, you were like, I didn't even know what a homosexual was. There are a couple of things that are different. One, there was more of a shame culture back then related to it. So it's not to say that there weren't homosexuals back then, because that is categorically false. But they were much less likely to come out and say, hey, I'm a homosexual or I'm gay. right?
I had a relative that was, so I knew what it
You know what I mean?
was. But
It's just, it was going to be much less likely because there was definitely a shame factor. Now you're living in a culture where there's no shame factor involved. There's a celebration factor. At the beginning of the clip that I referenced about Bill Maher, he kind of made a joke, and it totally broke me up. It was hilarious. It still ticked off the LGBTQ community. I was like, I'm sorry, that's funny. Because he said, you go back to the generation of Joe Biden, and like 1% of people were gay. If you fast forward to my generation, I'm Gen X, by the way. We have no identity. I'm Gen X. It was maybe 3-ish% of the population. You know, now you got in the current generation as much as 20 to 25% saying that they identify as gay. And he goes, at this rate, we're all gay by 2050. Right? Which is hilarious. I don't care who you are, it's funny, right? But it brings up an important point once you remove the shame factor. But I also think there's more to it. We are living in the most biblically illiterate generation in the history of our country, and that's to the shame of parents, not kids. It is not the job of kids to raise the parents. I wouldn't want my kids to raise me, frankly. But we have dropped if you're the exception, thank you. But think about what an active church member means now. Coming maybe once a month. What? I mean, how well do you think you're going to do when you are bombarded by the world, but I'm going to give God an hour a month? You're going to get took. I mean, let's face it. You are not a part of the church. You're not a part of the work of the kingdom. And I have this hunch that if you're only coming once a month, you're probably not in the Word a whole lot either. Like you have no practice, you have no habits. What do you think your kids are doing? Right? What do you think your kids are doing? So I think there has been this steady erosion in our culture, and my generation didn't create it, by the way. No offense, you got to go earlier. You got to go earlier. I tease my parents. Y'all were the free love, free sex generation. It's all on you. But
I wasn't in that.
Studies have been done.
That Revolution movie, I watched that, and there was some really good correlations that I saw. Maybe like the guy was like, they're trying to see light, they're trying to see joy, they're trying to seek this happiness they can't quite grasp. And I think sexuality and the celebration is kind of the replacement of drugs. Is really what it is. It's almost like they're just there's this like you said,
I get it.
Just development where we're not pouring into the truth, so they're just grabbing at straws at this point of whatever, and sexuality just seems to be the
my point is when you stop gatekeeping in a generation, it progresses with the next, and it progresses with the next. You also see this in scripture, right? I mean, the early practices of polygamy, all of a sudden you see it manifesting. It was like, they had 2 here, I've got 6 here. Now, where'd you get that from, Dad? Right? The sins you see, at some point, it's got to stop. But I think it gets back to your question, which is, I think, a good one. There are layers to that question, and it goes back a little bit. But it's like, well, if we live in the most biblically illiterate generation now, well, when did that start? It didn't start now.
There's a church on every corner.
It didn't start now. And we also we just don't value, generally speaking, the sacred as much as we used to. We just don't. And we're entertained. We're way too entertained. Way too entertained. Yeah.
So I struggle on 2 fronts. I work for a company that, celebrates pride, and
Sure.
I'm also a parent, and I'm terrified of the conversations I have to have as my kids grow up, and like how they're addressing other people who go through this, and how do we as Christians not buy into the you do you, which I know we talked about earlier, but like not go around convicting and scaring everybody that all Christians are hateful.
Yeah. Well, a couple of things. So the question is one, you just have a concern of raising a child, in the modern, cultural climate. And by the way, as we opened the Word tonight, 1 Corinthians 6, you think they felt that way as early Christians? I'm going to go with a yes. They probably felt a lot like we do, especially if you hold to a traditional view of sex and marriage, like I do. You can feel that pressure. That said, Wendy and I think have modeled for our girls that, we have very, very close friends that I think they know that there isn't anything in the world that we wouldn't do for them, and they would describe themselves as gay. Are they welcome in our home? They're welcome in our home. But, with our girls, it's our job to disciple them in the way to view life, right? And to model it for them. A lot of our faith is caught. And if what they can see is me loving people, and they can see that, hey, there is no split here, right? To disagree with someone is not to hate them. And in fact, to enable them in a lifestyle that Scripture says is harmful for them, that's not loving at all, right? But does that mean it closes the door when they're having a crisis in their life, and then they come to me and they say, I need help? I hope you would come to me. So they see all of that. And so for them, I don't think that they have any problem with what's the line? How do you hold it? And still being friends, for example. The catch is, and I'll share this with you, and I don't even know what the time is. I think that clock has given it. The ghost, yeah. So I'll say this. So I mentioned doing theology on tap before, right? And especially when we were having to discuss sexuality, which turns up every time. Right? It doesn't matter what the topic is, but it gets there. One of the things that was interesting to me was after one night was over with and we'd had a discussion about this, the Bible and homosexuality. This is what was interesting. I had a number of, they were gay men. They came and talked with me. They appreciated the way that I handled myself. They're like, we don't think that you hate us. I was like, well, that's good to hear, because I don't. I want something that's good for you. Here was what they said that was interesting to me that I was like, wow, okay. What they said was, the problem that we have, meaning them, not me. They said the problem that they have is it's not enough for us to be gay. They said we have to be gay and advance the agenda. And we're not about it. That's not what we're about. That was an interesting thing for them to say, because they followed it up with, sometimes being in this community is one of the most lonely communities I've ever been a part of. Because it's not enough for me to be gay. I have to be gay and I have to be an activist with the things they expect me to be an activist for, and we're not interested in it. So it is interesting, right? If you look at some of the static, Preston Sprinkle, I've mentioned before, Theology in the Raw is his podcast, and he does a lot with this topic. This is kind of his area of specialization. He was writing a book, A People to Be Loved, which was about homosexuality. And he said he was talking with a gay friend of his, and he was like, yeah, what are you working on, Preston? He goes, well, I'm finishing this book on, the Bible and homosexuality. He goes, well, by the time you're done with it, it's already going to be out of date, because the issue is going to be transgenderism. And he was right. So Preston wrote a book called Embodied, which I will actually quote from when we get into that study. He said, but he was absolutely right. It's like the conversation had already moved on, right? And so here we are. What do we do with it? So I don't know if what I've said is actually helpful at all. We model. I'm not afraid of anything, And at the end of the day, if somebody comes against me, with vitriol and anger, that's not me. I'm not the one doing it. I'm gonna love them well. I'm gonna show them Jesus, and I'm gonna hold the line. I think that's the right way of going about it, and that's what we encourage our girls to do as well. Yeah, Brian.
Yeah, this may be more commentary.
Okay.
With a question at the end, but it seems to me the church does not give the homosexual an option.
The church doesn't give the homosexual an option?
An option, because we talk about, we don't separate same-sex attraction, in my opinion. We don't separate same-sex attraction from the act. The act is the sin. That's what we've been talking about. You mentioned many Christians that have same-sex attraction, and they've been able to stay away from the lifestyle.
That's right.
I think so many go into the lifestyle, and you just mentioned it, to carry on the agenda, because that's the only people that accept them. As a church, we have said, get out of here.
Right.
Because I don't know how we do it, but that's what we do.
Yeah, no, look, to your point, and look, I have to say this, is a person that has same-sex attraction welcome at this church? Well, I hope so.
I hope so too.
Are they going to be shown love and respect in this church? I hope so. I hope so, just the same that I hope a gossiper is loved and welcomed.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, I'm not going to cherry pick things here. Right? If I'm going to hold the line in one, I'm just going to have to hold the line. And part of the love is to support people in their struggle. To encourage. Sam Alberry, who describes himself as a same-sex attracted male, he's married to a female. And I talked about Rebecca McLaughlin, who is married to a man. She's like a wonderful man. He shows me love and respect. Anytime I struggle with a sexual temptation, it's always toward a woman. She goes, but I won't. I gave you an example of a friend of mine in North Carolina, active in the church. And he says, I realize when I have that desire kind of do like this up in me, I have a choice to make. Am I going to honor Jesus with my body, or am I going to go that way? He goes, and he said, to God's kindness to me, I have honored Jesus with that. And he goes, I don't know. It's just always there. Where'd it come from? I don't know, but it's there. But I won't. But I won't. And to the point, and I told him, I said, hey, look, friend, I know plenty of men in the church that would do well with that with porn. I have this desire in me, but I won't. But they do. Right? But they do. Or adultery, or whatever. We still have that part of, we are a part of a church. And for me, especially when you look at the church discipline thing, because it came up earlier, it's a process. It's not the kind of thing you're like, well, by next Monday, we need to have this resolved. Slow your roll a little bit. What if you actually see a person making progress? I hope you wouldn't remove them from the church. I think it's when it gets to that blatant rebellion that you go, for the good of the church at this point. Literally to protect them from you, because a little leaven. But when you see the rest of it, when you see a person who's like, I'm struggling with this and help me with this, I'm going to honor that every day of the week and twice on Sunday, and I want them here. I want them here.
Soon enough in the process.
No, I agree. We're not catching it soon enough in the process. And some of this, honestly, is we deal with a negative reputation from people like Westboro Baptist Church. Those people don't help. I mean, if you're going to stand out and say God hates you, I'm like, did you try anything else? Like, did anything else cross your mind? Right? Who did Jesus hang out with? Right? I don't know. I'm just looking at Jesus. He was constantly hanging out with broken folk. Right? Why? So that they could find the better way. I hope that's what we would be about. I do. I don't think any of my friends that are gay wonder where I'm at. They know. Maybe I'm giving myself more credit here than I should, but I'm going to say it anyway. I don't think they wonder if I love them, because too many of them have been in crisis situations, and my phone was the one that rang, and I said, "Let's meet. Let's do it. We're going to figure this out." It's just I hope a positive and better picture for the church is that. And this is only one part of it. We still have the T part of the LGBTQ to talk about. We haven't gotten there. We're doing that next week. We're about out of time. But Charles, I think did you have your hand up or no?
Yeah, it was something to do with the studies.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe levels of attraction. Like are people confused with, say, like they're 10 years old and they say, I like this. Or, I like
levels of attraction
and that one, nice shirt to a 10 to where it's
Yeah. Well, there's only so much I take from like a 13-year-old. Middle school was probably the worst time of my life. I think it's the worst time of everybody's life. What a weird time, right? There's so much going on in there. I'm going to unpack a little bit more of this, but there's a guy, Jeffrey Satinover. He's actually at the Harvard. He's at the Harvard Med School, and one of the things that he gets into is, and this I think pushes back on the hardwired thing. The brain is, you might have heard the word neuroplastic. Have you ever heard of the neuroplasticity of the brain? That by itself would let you know that things can change. Now, here's the catch. And actually, you know what? I'm going to thumb through and I'm going to find what Jerry said, because he says it better than me. He's a researcher at Harvard Med School. Here's what he said. I'm going to share it with you. And then I think you had your hand up, and then we'll land the plane. He said the neocortex is the part of the brain that we might consider the seat of the will. I don't think that's in your brain. I think it's in your soul, but we'll let it go. Here's what he goes on to say. It is also the part of the brain whose connections between neurons will be slowly modified over time, strengthening some connections, weakening others, and eliminating others entirely, all based on how your choices and your experiences shape you. But your choices are the most important thing. This ongoing process embeds the emerging pattern of our choices even more firmly in the actual tissue changes of your brain. These changes make it that much more likely for us to make the same choice with less direct effort the next time, and that much more difficult to make a different choice. This regards your sexuality, but it regards a lot of things. You know the jokes about good luck, he's an old man, good luck changing his mind? Yeah, this is it. But how did he get there? And the answer is he got himself there.
You're saying it's a cumulative?
It's cumulative, right? It's also reversible. It's reversible, and that's the point. So that's why I said, if you look at, like, we can do trauma studies on the brain. You can do fMRI imaging for a person that has undergone a trauma, and you can literally see the brain impact of trauma on it. You can see the brain impact of trauma. You can see it. It's nuts. There's only so much that I want to say because, well, it's late, and I haven't had dinner. I'm hungry. I'm starving at this point, y'all. But you can actually see it. Here's the thing. You can actually, through like with trauma, EMDR therapy is proving to be the best therapy that's out there. We're not going to worry about that tonight, but I'm letting you know it's called eye desensitization, movement desensitization and reprogramming. And what it actually has to do is with a reprogramming of your brain, and it involves your eyes. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. But here's what they're finding is people that were profoundly impacted by trauma, it can be reversed. People can find healing. It is in there. It can happen. And notice what you find. You can find a new sexual identity. But if you're a person that says, no, I am my sexual identity, so I am gay, then on that side, here's what that means. If you disagree with me, you're rejecting me. Does that make sense? This is who I am. And my point is no, this is an attraction you have. It's a lifestyle that you're choosing. Again, the born this way is out. It's not an option. It's a lifestyle that you're choosing. You might be settling yourself more and more and more and more by your choices into this direction. Does that make sense? But it is reversible, but not by keeping the path. You actually have to walk a different way. You have to walk a different way. And then what happens? You walk a different way, and all of a sudden, other neurons start to fire. Brain literally starts to get rewired, but it's work. It's hard. How many of you have had a habit to break? How easy was that? Yeah, exactly. So don't act like it was easy. Stop it.
There's a lot of people talking about affirming this stuff.
That would, all right. So, but your point about parents affirming it goes back to the cultural climate, which makes it that much easier to do. I mean, moral boundaries actually help us. They don't hurt us, and we all set them. I don't know anybody that doesn't. You know, even the people that say you do you, right? They wouldn't buy that if I was like, you know, I kind of liked what Hitler was up to. Oh, you don't do that. No, you don't get to do that. You said you do you, and you know, genocide. I'm kind of feeling it today. You know, nobody's going to go with that, right? All of a sudden, it's like we need to draw some lines here. Rape.
I just don't.
So you use difficult examples, but it helps make a point. You don't really believe this. Even you don't believe this. So when we're drawing lines, we're drawing them for good reasons, not to harm people, but to help. That's what love is. That's what love is. All right. I think you...
Yeah.
All right. This, and then we're done.
This is for another time.
Okay.
I'd like you to address, which I didn't know this, guys, but someone told me recently that gay people, or whatever, yeah, they care for transgender people. And I didn't know that until someone pointed that out to me.
So the relationship between the gay community and the transgender community?
Yeah.
There's some static there.
I know there is, and I don't.
Not everywhere, obviously, but there is some static
I
there.
don't understand it, but we know somebody, I told you that is.
Yeah.
And I just am kind of ignorant about a lot of
Okay.
things,
Well, we're moving on to transgenderism next week.
Okay.
So, with it. All right, I'm going to pray our way out, and then I think I'm going to eat.
You gotta eat early.
Dude, it's been busy, I actually had a Snickers bar that this is going to have to work, like the commercials, where I become a totally different person. I was like, I'm about there. I'm going to pray our way out. I hope to see you on Sunday, my friends, 9 o'clock or 10:30, and bring a friend. Let's worship. We'll be in Daniel chapter 4, where Daniel has another vision or another dream, and it's not good. Nebuchadnezzar. And, yeah. Come on. Bad dreams. All right, I'm going to pray. We're thankful, Lord, for your word, and I pray tonight would be of good use to my friends here. We are definitely living in a culture that is at odds with your word, but these are friends to us and people that we love very much. And so I pray that this would help us as we're out, as we are who you've asked us to be, which is salt and light to this world. I pray it would help. It would help us to hold the line that you created, not us, but that we would hold the truth in love. Because frankly, everybody's coming from the same place we did. It's a place of brokenness. It's a place of sin and needing healing. And we believe that you can provide that. We really do. I pray that you would help us as we minister to people to not do anything that would get in the way of the work that you want done. Strengthen us with your Spirit as we go. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.